I think the next couple of days are going to be a really exciting time of dialogue, and we're starting tonight with a lecture by Steven Loft. So this event came together through the participation and assistance of lots of people, and I'll turn it over to Josh Londier to thank some of those folks.
Well, First Nation Studies and Indigenous Services were a big support in promoting the event. Susan Edelstein, who has been a person organizing stuff on the university campus here at Western for quite a while, was so supportive in terms of shaping the event, as was Professor Joy James, the chair of visual arts, who gave us financial as well as intellectual support. Colin Carney, who's here with his class from the Art Now class, I think I had the title of that right, who are dispersed amongst us. Thank you very much for coming. It's very nice of you. We have with us tonight the Dean of Arts and Humanities, Mike Millie, who has been an absolute foundation of support for this program in terms of not just financial support, but intellectual support, moral support. It's been a tremendous experience starting the Public Humanities with the support of our Dean. James Patton, Director and Chief Curator at Macintosh Gallery, comes with a wealth of experience from previous placements at Museum London, the Art Gallery of Windsor, the Winnipeg Art Gallery, and elsewhere, and is leading the Macintosh forward at the exciting time in the university's evolution. Since I first approached James to help us with the planning of a Public Humanities event, he's been an incredible support. His door is always open to not only come in and chat about upcoming exhibitions and events, but also to bring in ideas for collaboration. The purpose of this program, the Public Humanities, is to foster a renewed spirit of citizenship and engagement. And he definitely embodies a genuine support, a genuine champion of these ideas at Western. So please join me in welcoming James Patton.
Steven is a curator media artist, a Mohawk, and he's Trudeau Foundation Fellow at Ryerson University, where he lectures on Indigenous art. Prior to this, he was Curator-In-Residence of Indigenous Art at the National Gallery of Canada and Director-Curator of Urban Shaman Gallery in Winnipeg. He was also Aboriginal Curator at the Art Gallery of Hamilton and Artistic Director of the Native Inuit Photographers Association. He has curated exhibitions nationally and internationally, most recently as co-curator of Close Encounters, The Next 500 Years, and is the largest exhibition of contemporary Indigenous art ever mounted in Canada. In 2005, Steven co-edited Transference, Technology and Tradition, Aboriginal Media and New Media Art, which examined how inexpensive new technologies have influenced Aboriginal artists. And Loft is a member of the Fuse editorial committee, thus the relationship. I wanted to thank Gina Badger as well for hosting the magazine launch, the Fuse magazine launch at Macintosh Gallery directly after this. And I hope you'll all come over. Steven's going to be there, and Gina, and we hope you'll all join us at the Macintosh. But right now, please help me in welcoming Steven Loft.
This is my iPad, which I love. This is my tobacco, which I also love. They're both actually forms of communicating. One very new, one very ancient, but both very relevant in today's society. So I first want to acknowledge the lands that we stand on. I want to acknowledge both Algonquian nations and Iroquoian nations who lived in this area, who traded in this area, who hunted, fished, and made a living in this area, and especially to the neutral people, the Atawandarin, and I hope I have that right. I thank my brother Dan for that bit of knowledge. And when we do this, it's not some simple courtesy. It's not a tradition in the sense that we do it just because we come up in front of a bunch of people. It's an acknowledgement, but it's also our way of claiming space for the people who are here and for the people who are no longer here. It is about sovereignty. It is about an Indigenous way of being. It's a way of honoring those people, their rituals, their ceremonies, their elders, the people who are here and the people who came before. So I do that with respect. And I also want to thank my own relations, the elders of my community, the leaders of my community, which is the Ganyanga, the Mohawk of the Six Nations. I want to thank them for giving me a voice and allowing me to speak here today. And I want to thank you all for being here and wanting to hear what I have to say. And so tonight's talk, a little different for me. It's called Lies Your Nation Told You. Why I decided on this? I've been a little pissed off recently. More so than usual, actually. Because I've usually got a fair bit of anger happening. But a little bit more than usual. Because I hate, you know, there's a few things that really, really bug you. And that's when people lie to you. And we've been lied to a lot. And so today's lecture is a bit about lying, and a little bit about looking at history, and a little bit about politics, and a little bit about art. So I'm going to try to weave those things together. So I hope you'll kind of come along with me and see where we can go with it. I want to start off with a quote by a Maori scholar, Linda Tuai Smith. And she wrote, "Non-Indigenous history is an invention of dominant society, written to exclude Indigenous values and views while claiming to be an objective and accurate portrayal of the chronology of events, when in reality it is a tool of domination." So what we have to remember, what we have to understand, especially when a place like this, a university, a place about critical thinking, about how we relate to each other, how we relate to the past, the present, and the future. What you have to understand is you're only getting one perspective. You're only getting one story. And that's okay if you get the other side as well, if you get the other stories as well. So what I want to do tonight is talk about some of those stories that you might not be as familiar with. But in fairness to certain histories, let's leave this right now. We'll come back to you. And we'll start with that arbiter of all things Canadian and uber nationalist, Don Cherry, to give us a little reality check.
What are you saying, that
I'm saying
natives have an inferiority complex is when something happens to them?
I said you'd have to ask Chris, but why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't some kids feel like they haven't been given a fair shake in life? Ask Davis Inlet.
Fair shake in life. Go out and get your own fair shake in life and work for it. Don't give me that stuff. Don't give me it. It's like Ted Nolan. When Ted Nolan didn't get the job, it was racism. It was racism. It wasn't racism. Him and Muckler got at it, and that's why he didn't get hired. So don't give me that stuff.
But since you bring that up, if you were an NHL club and you saw all the reaction when Ted was fired in Buffalo, would you be a little leery of hiring him a second time?
Yeah, well,
so he is in a case.
It wasn't racism, no. It was because
it is.
No, it isn't. It was
the uprising will cause.
It was between him and the GM. That's why he didn't get it. It wasn't racism at all. And let's never get into that again. I've lost the whole thing.
No, it's good.
No, it isn't. Well, we might as well just sit here and then.
No.
How much time we got left?
We got a couple minutes.
Thank you, Don. Okay. The Prime Minister of Alberta. He's the one I'm mad at right now. And we'll go into some of the reasons why. Because his objective is to eliminate Indians. It has been for quite a while. It comes from a long history of it. It's kind of not even his fault. But what really pisses me off is when he's not honest about it. When he goes, does stuff like that, he dishonors me, my ancestors, and you too. Because he's lying. You don't take an honor like putting on this headdress, wearing this paint, when in fact every policy that you put out, every bit of your ideological DNA is about eliminating Indians. Harper said to a meeting of the G20, Canada has no history of colonialism. No history of colonialism. In fact, Canada has a vicious, nasty, and decidedly devious colonial history. And just to bring things to date a little bit, there's a lot of people saying, oh, but Steve did say, we signed the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. That was Harper. He signed it after a couple of years not wanting to. Yeah, he did. But the proviso is, the Canadian government has as its policy on the UN Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous People, they say that it is a non-legally binding aspirational document. Now, I don't know what that means, but in practice it has meant that they do not hold to any of the conventions in that particular document. Canada has no history of colonialism. Well, I think Kent Monkman would disagree. The colonial project in Canada has included aggressive assimilationist policies, willful and purposive neglect, and emotional, spiritual, cultural, and physical violence. This is a work by Kent Monkman, Winnipeg-born artist, now living in Toronto, called My Treaty. I love Kent's work because he skewers the colonial view. He posits an Indigenous presence. He's very well known for his works where he recreates these lush landscapes that were done by primarily British but European painters, and then populates them with these wonderful scenes of Indigenous people. And usually they include Kent, who is the central figure on his knees there, as his performance alter ego, Miss Chief Eagle Testicle. And in this particular work, you can see Miss Chief bowing, supplicating to the British rule. Obviously, he's talking about the colonial enterprise. At first glance, you might say, well, he's saying that yes, there is colonialism, and we should supplicate ourselves to it. On the left, you see the Aboriginal people, clearly not so enthused. But what Ken is also bringing into this is not only some interesting humor and a very interesting homoerotic take on the whole supplication of peoples, but he brings also into it some Judeo-Christian ideologies. And, washing of feet has traditionally been the ultimate act of subjugation. But as we know, Jesus turned that around by himself washing the feet of beggars and lepers, and meant to say that even the highest up can wash your feet. So here Kent is sort of playing with all of these interesting European, Christian, and Indigenous systems, showing how they come into contact, and as usual, there's violence. We can see the dog on this side, held back by the British. We know, for example, when the conquistadors came, dogs were used to not only round up Indigenous people, but were used to kill them. Indigenous people were fed to dogs as a method of domination. I want to tell you a story. It's 1763. just at the tail end of what had been called the French and Indian Wars. The British were feeling pretty good about themselves, about the colonies, but there remained a problem. There was a chief of the Odawas, his name was Pontiac, they named cars after him. And he, along with allies, started to fight, or to continue to fight. Because Pontiac knew that the British would not let them rest, would not let them stay on their land. So together with some other allies, which included the Iroquois nations from this area, and down into the Six Nations territory, started to attack British forts, quite successfully actually. What's been called Pontiac's Rebellion by Canadian and American historians, called Pontiac's Resistance by many Aboriginal people. But what happened is Pontiac and his followers captured 6 British forts and were on their way to actually routing the British by themselves. The British, not too pleased about that, were very worried. Their forces had been depleted by the war. They were sending many of their forces to fight Napoleon, so they didn't have extras to send to Canada. And the commander of all the British forces in the Canadas, Lord Geoffrey Amherst, decided that this had to stop. So they found out that Pontiac was marching on Fort Pitt, known as Pittsburgh, and Amherst came up with a plan. So we got in touch with the commander of Fort Pitt, a dude by the name of Colonel Henry Bouquet, a great British name, I don't know how that came about. And they decided that they knew that they couldn't defeat the warriors. So they thought, we'll kill them off by, and in his words, by inoculating them. And they inoculated them with smallpox. And they did this using blankets, which they gave as gifts to the warriors. They invited Pontiac and his war chiefs to come in and said they were going to surrender, and then gave them gifts of blankets. This is a piece of work by artist Bob Boyer called The Smallpox Issue. It's from a series he did on blankets that reference this, as well as the blanket, that's the Bay blanket, which has a long history in terms of the relationship with the Aboriginal people in this country, where he examines the death and destruction that came from this act, from the first recorded incidents of biological warfare in human history. They infected people with smallpox. The effect was catastrophic. It went through not only Pontiac's people, but erased throughout this area. It decimated the Indigenous nations. This is a work, I'm sure, sorry that the picture isn't as good as I would like. This is a work by an artist, Robert Poole. It is called Palisade 2. This also references this particular piece in our history. You'll see that on either side, there's 6 paintings, and then a collage piece in the middle. And it's set up in a corner very specifically, because it's supposed to look like the palisade of a fort. On the right-hand side here, you see each of the paintings is very strong. It's monochromatic. If you can see them, they're really quite brilliant and beautiful. And each one represents one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, who were allies of Pontiac. On the other side, you see 6 images that also correspond to those colors. What Houle has done is he's tried through his lens, through his abstract lens, to show the devastation caused to those 6 nations. Now, he hasn't completely wiped them out, which is interesting, because they weren't wiped out, because they are still here. We are still here. We've been damaged. We were decimated, but we were not destroyed. But we'll never be the same. And that's also part of that. The piece in the middle, it's this wonderful collage of images. One of them is a newspaper story from the 80s, where they talked about destroying the last sample of smallpox that the American government had. The other is drawings Robert has done of smallpox virus. And the other is the postscripts of the letters between Amherst and Bouquet. This is how we know. And this is what they said. Bouquet to Amherst. I will try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets that may fall in their hands, taking care, however, not to get the disease myself. As it is pity to oppose good men against them, I wish we could make use of the Spaniards' method and hunt them with English dogs, supported by rangers and some light horse, would, I think, effectively extirpate or remove that vermin. Amherst replies, you will do well to try to inoculate the Indians by means of blankets, as well as to try every other method that can serve to extirpate this execrable race. I should be very glad your scheme for hunting them down by dogs could take effect, but England is at too great a distance to think of that at present. And Bouquet, I received yesterday your Excellency's letters with their enclosures. The signal for Indian messengers and all your directions will be observed. This is a plate that they, until into the 80s, used at Amherst College as their official plate. And as you can see, there's a British soldier on horseback hunting Indians with a sword. Ah, treaties. Talk about lies. This is a good one. Treaties are a question of rights. Simple. Simple, simple, simple. Or maybe not. Now, we are all treaty people. We're treaty people because treaties are negotiations, settlements between sovereign nations. So when we have a treaty, even if it's not my people who sign it, I'm a treaty person because I am implicated in that. You are implicated in that. You're responsible for it. And so is your government. And so am I. And so is my government. The treaties were created to establish a system wherein lands of Indigenous people could be gained for settlement, in exchange for certain guarantees, more than mere land transfer deals, the position of the current government. Treaties outline a broad, expansive, and future-thinking agreement of obligation between sovereign nations. At least that's what we thought. Treaty Commissioner Morris enunciated in this way from the other side. The Queen wishes her red children to learn the cunning of the white man. Because maybe then we could sign some treaties and not honor them ourselves, perhaps. Now, I don't want to get into a long discussion of the history and legal standing of Canada's treaties with Aboriginal people, but I will read from a letter from some chiefs that was sent to the Prime Minister in 1883. We were once a proud and independent people, and now we can get neither food, nor clothing, nor the means necessary to make a living for ourselves. The treaty is a farce enacted to kill us. slowly. Now if I say Attawapiskat, Kasheshawan, Burt Church, I think you know where we're going with this. They've been killing us slowly for a long time. We still can't get enough to eat. We still can't get clothing. We still don't have the means of survival. The treaties talked about all of those things. They talked about the land, talked about what was under it. They haven't been honored. Because the language is archaic, or because they were signed by the Crown and the government of Canada feels that it doesn't have to honor those. Treaties. Sovereign peoples making a solemn agreement of obligation, of responsibility, not conquest, sharing, based on mutual respect, based on honor, and based on the fact that we are equals. That's gone to shit, and I don't like it. Another piece by Ken Bungman. I just love to show his work, where Miss Chief gesturing to a beautiful British boy to come with her, join her on a trip in his canoe to share. Many things, I'm sure, but to share. Saying, no, come with me. This land is for all of us. Work by Sunny Asu. Enjoy Post Salish territory. So the next time you're on it, enjoy it. Just don't try to buy it. And another work by Sunny called Treaty Flicks. Because really, that's all they're worth right now. Gerald McMaster's Trick or Treating. That brings up an interesting one. John A. Macdonald, sort of the father of Canada kind of thing. First Prime Minister. Railway, you know, all the great things that he did. But he hated Indians, despised them. Once said, when he was the former Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Department of Indian Affairs, when the school is on the reserve, the child lives with his parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages, and though he may learn to read and write, he is simply a savage who can read and write. And he goes on later to justify residential schools. We know how that turned out. I'm going to tell you another story. 1885. Some of you may be aware that time was there was lots of expansion in Canada, but it was also a time of rebellion. Louis Riel, that ne'er-do-well, was rising up and trying to take Manitoba for the Métis, the half-breeds. Canada, a young country then, really was very afraid of the small group of Métis. Not so much afraid of them, afraid of all the Indians who may join them. They were so afraid of that. The Métis numbered maybe in the hundreds, really. And Canada could probably put a force together to put them down. But if the thousands of Indians who were by now being shuffled onto reserves through a treaty, if they decided to go to war, we were in big trouble. And MacDonald knew full well that his Indian agents had been starving the people, had been not giving them access to the animals that had been promised, the farming implements that had been promised, the expertise that had been promised, and the food that had been promised. Why? Because they wanted to starve them out. Simple as that. Once you took them off their territories where they couldn't hunt anymore, buffalo were gone. They just starve them. And that's what they did. But oh no, uh-oh, what if they rise up? Seriously? Canadian government would have taken a shit kicking. Bad. So, what they did is they went to all the reserves, tried to talk all the chiefs into staying loyal. Said if you stray off the reserve, the agreement's nullified. The Indian agent won't give you anything. Stay away from Riel. And you know what? They did. They stayed on the reserves. Riel sent emissaries, trying to get them. Went to Big Bear, went to Poundmaker. They didn't. They stayed loyal. They stayed loyal. They starved. A few of them, of course, joined up or were forced to. Of course. Not surprising. When the rebellion was put down, they charged a whole bunch of Métis and a bunch of Indians. They imprisoned a bunch of Indians, mostly the leaders, Big Bear, Poundmaker, went to jail. They executed one Métis, Louis. Still a disgrace. It's a disgrace, this country. But on November 27th, 1885, they hung 8 Plains Indian warriors. They hadn't been in positions of power or authority. They weren't the leaders. 8, one day, the biggest mass hanging in Canadian history. For what? For being disloyal. MacDonald at the time wrote about the massacre. This will teach the red man that the white man governs. I guess so. The Indian Act of 1876, that piece of genocidal, racist legislation that governs us all. Well, not you, maybe. What governs me. The Indian Act is premised to ensure that all Aboriginal people ultimately disappear. Even though we're the largest growing demographic in Canada, the largest growing demographic in Canada. The Indian Act ensures that we will become extinct as Indigenous peoples. At the recent Harbour Crown First Nations gathering, one of the key things that the Assembly of First Nations, who are our representatives there, was fighting for was the elimination of the Indian Act. This thing has killed us. It's made it possible for residential schools. It's made it possible for the Attawapiscats and the Kasheshawans. It's one of the biggest reasons we're 33% of the population, but 12% of the prison population. It's the reason we didn't have the vote till 1960. This piece of garbage has to go. I don't know how that's not a real simple thing. Except, Mr. Harper says, our government has no grand scheme to repeal or unilaterally rewrite the Indian Act. After 136 years, that tree has deep roots. Blowing up the stump would leave a big hole. Yeah, full of Indians. This is a piece by, who was Paul Yuxwell-Upton, called An Indian Act Shooting the Indian Act. And there's him actually doing it. You have to understand what this piece of legislation is. It is, at its heart, racist and genocidal. There's no other piece of legislation in Canada that specifically speaks to a cultural or ethnic group. This act governs me because I am an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act. That phrase means I'm a status Indian. Now, I couldn't fucking care less if the Canadian government thinks I'm an Indian or not. I care if my people say I'm an Indian. I care if my family does. But I don't care what they say. And being a status Indian is no great chase. I won't go deeply into it. Again, we could spend the whole evening here talking about the Indian Act. But yes, I pay my fucking taxes. I don't get school for free. I don't live off your hard-earned dollars. So get those things out of your head if you have them there. There are a lot of really, really good places to go to look at how this is impacted. I would advise you to look at them. There's one particularly good one by Pam Palmenter, who's an academic at Ryerson University where I am right now, and a legal scholar, called Beyond Blood. It's an excellent look at the Indian Act. If you want to know more about sort of what happens in the plains from Riel and the Indians on November 27th, Blair Stonechild has a fantastic book called Loyal Till Death. The reason, not only has it done all these things to us in the past, and it got changed, and little things happened to it, but it's going to eliminate us in the future. Why? Because the Indian Act says that the government gets to decide who's an Indian. Not my family, not my band, not my nation, the Canadian government. And they are legislating us out of existence. And here's how it works. The Canadian government said, okay, Steve, you're an Indian. You are an Indian within the meaning of the Indian Act. That means your status. That means you're a 0-1. Full blood. Except that I'm not. But it's not, that's not how it works. It's this mathematical issue. So I'm a 0-1. Well, that's cool. Any children I have are status Indians too. Oh, good, you say. Except they're 0-2s if I have them as a non-Aboriginal woman. The 0-2 means none of their children will be Indians unless my son is with an Aboriginal woman. As well, for the longest time, if an Aboriginal woman married a non-Aboriginal man, she lost her status completely, immediately. And so did any children that she had. That was rectified with a change to the Indian Act, except that it's not retroactive. And so anybody who became a status Indian through that change only became a 0-2. All those, so it strikes at women, which is the easiest way to end the bloodline, and it eliminates us. Hybridization and coming together is a part of what we are. People are going to intermarry, they're going to have kids together. Some of you may want to have a child with me already, I don't know. That's a fact in the place where we live. We're not in a place that's all Aboriginal people. Of course we're going to do that. Does that make them less Aboriginal? And who decides? What right does the Canadian government have telling me who an Indian is? That's for us to decide. And yeah, it'll get a little messy. And yeah, there'll be some disagreements. And yeah, it's complex. It's not simple. But this is ridiculous. It's racist. And it's a way to kill us. That's at the very heart of it. And it will. It will eliminate us. Trouble with that is, we don't go away. Whether status or not status, well, they can call me whatever they want. I'm going young Mohawk. That will not change. Another version, Nadia Mir. She took the Indian Act and vetoed it. She went to communities all over this country, took every single page of the Indian Act, and had people beat it, replace those words, change those words, reinscribe it with indigeneity, with who we are. Took that act and made it, not hers, but she didn't do it all herself, made it ours, indigenized it, Indianed it up. What that says is, we don't accept your act. We don't accept your racist legislation. What we do accept is our way of thinking, our way of being, our way of knowing, our epistemologies, our ontologies, our philosophies, our art histories, our sociologies, because they're different. We will see the world through our eyes, and we'll see the world through our way of being. Being is one of those. It's another way we communicate. It's another way we pass on culture, tradition. Not through an Indian Act. Jordan Bennett, performing the Indian Act. He took the Indian Act, made a teepee out of it. Did it in a park in St. John's, Newfoundland, where they say they have no Indians, but they do. Built himself a teepee and wrote out the Indian Act, word for word. It was a bigger job than he thought it was going to be. He's a young guy. He didn't realize the Indian Act's like 155 pages. He was sore. People in St. John's didn't quite get it. First of all, they looked at him like, are you trying to be like a terrorist? You got that thing covering your face? What's that all about? He's like, no, it's cold out. Sorry. What's that on your head? It's like, well, it's a headpiece. He had made for him, gifted to him to wear, to show who he was. So he's out there looking like this powwow dancing terrorist, basically. In the middle of the park in St. John's, writing up the Indian Act. For him, it was a way of taking it and making it powerless. Taking it, refuting it. He used this declaration for his TV. In 1990, the world changes. Changes. For me, anyway. Okay. The standoff. The war to end all wars for us. And Mohawks, mostly, and their allies, stood up to first the Quebec government and then the federal government and said, no, enough is enough. They wanted to make a golf course. They wanted to build it not only on Ganyangahaka land, but on a burial site. I mean, isn't it bad enough that they still have bones of our ancestors in countless museums in this country and others? You have to do that? You have to dishonor our ancestors that way? No! Enough! Enough! And then for me, a piece of art that changed it all. It changed my life. Ganawage, 270 Years of Resistance, a film by Alanis Swan, possibly the most important documentary ever made in this country. And I don't say that in a flippant way. If you have not seen this film, you have to see it. You have to see it to understand where we are, where we come from, where we're going. All of us, not just Aboriginal people. You have to understand what it means to stand up for your land, for your culture, for your traditions, for your ceremonies, for your rituals, for your ancestors, for your family, for your nation in this country. It's going on in places all over the world. We've seen it happening a lot in the last few years. Why is it here it's not acknowledged? It's not acknowledged as a revolutionary struggle. It never will be. Certainly not under this government. Face to face with the Canadian government, with the military. The military had never ever been called out to fight its own people in this country. Because we are Canadians, marginally. We're wards of Canada. They stood up. And this film, that's when I knew I wanted to make Aboriginal art. I wanted to make things like that first. Never did make anything like it, but one can always hope. It's a piece called Gunnistage X. Rather cool. It's simple, it's beautiful. Again, he uses his color fields to talk about the different protagonists. A very large piece. You really don't get a sense of it. He made that in the heart of the conflict. Thought this is where it ends. This is where it could all end. By Newman's pieces. Those are golf bags. They've been made into totems. It's called Life on the 18th Hole by David Neal. It's a bit like Jordan Bennett from Indian piece. War shirts, or my self-portrait as a war shirt by Joan Cardinal Sugar, made in 1990 as well. Radicals, adversaries. Recently in the Calgary Herald, there was an article that said, the federal government is distancing itself from its own lobbying and public relations campaign to polish the image of Alberta's oil sands, following revelations that an internal strategy document labeled First Nations and environmentalists as adversaries. Radicals, terrorists, we've heard it all. Whenever it fits the government's agenda, we're vilified. All happy, happy, joy, joy when, when they don't need to control the message. But we stand in the way of their fucking pipeline. We all know what we become then. It's interesting too, because there's a very cool, or not so cool, historical precedent. In February of 1884, Deputy Superintendent of Indian Affairs wrote to John A. that an example should be made of chiefs or Indians who are guilty of infractions of the law. As a result, troublesome chiefs, that's a direct quote, became the targets of police actions. And then MacDonald authorized the arrest of chiefs who were considered, and again I quote, agitators, and to use whatever police force was necessary. Like I say, Harper's ideological roots go way back to the start. Harper and MacDonald have more in common than just a political party. Another piece by Lawrence Paul Yaxwell-Lupton. The killer whale had a vision and came to talk to me. Lawrence often uses environmental issues in his art. He also obviously uses Northwest Coast imagery. The ovoids, for example, being very classic. Yet he contemporizes them, and not only does he create his people using them, but as you can see, he uses them to create landscapes. Here's another one. I watched as the white men tried to fix a hole in the sky. He's such a radical. Rebecca Belmont, another fabulous artist whose work often looks at how Indigenous people have interacted and the oppressive nature of the state, whether it be British or Canadian. In this piece called Fountain, which was part of the Venice Biennale in 2005, what she does is she starts a ritual fire on the land. It's a video piece, so I should say that. She goes in, it's shot in Vancouver. She goes into the harbor with this bucket, gathers water. When she comes out, she throws it at the camera. Interestingly, it very much looks like oil when it first comes out, and then we realize once it hits the screen, it becomes blood. She's talking about not only Indigenous attachment to the land, to the water, to blood. Water and blood for us are represent the same things. They're about the continuation of life. They're about fertility. And they're connected to us. Here she also raises the question of water and what we're doing to it. And at the same time, she talks about the blood of our people, the blood of the land, her blood. Oh yeah, this dude, Frederick Ogilvie Loft. And yes, he is a relative, I'm very proud to say. He's a very interesting guy. Back at one of the great policies of government was an idea called enfranchisement. What this was a way of, again, assimilating Indigenous people. The feeling was very much that Indians are savages and they will never take their place in civilization. They will die out eventually or will kill themselves. Except, we do recognize that some of them might be okay. Some of them might be able to become more than just savages who read and write. So what do we do with them? Well, they came up with this great plan. And that was, if you got smart enough, or if you did enough, you could become enfranchised, which meant that you became almost like a real Canadian citizen. I mean, you lost your status, and you ceased to be an Indian because, well, of course, you're smart enough, so how could you be an Indian? And so, anytime there was an Aboriginal person who started to excel, or who went to school, then they would ask them if they wanted to be enfranchised. A great idea. Who wouldn't want to be a Canadian citizen? Who wants to be a savage? Well, I didn't get very many people. Even the ones who were going to school didn't want to lose what it was that made them who they were. So then they thought, well, of course, they're savages. We will forcibly enfranchise them. So what happened is that they came up with a law that said if you got a degree from a university or a job with the government, you would be automatically enfranchised. One less Indian, and two, will show you that civilization is better than your savage ways. Frederick Ogilvie Loft, they tried to enfranchise him. He was a First World War veteran, came back, lived in Toronto. He was very well educated and thought, we're getting the shit in here. Like what we went over and fought in Europe, in the trenches. We came back on nothing. Other soldiers were given land, but Indians can't get given land. It's against the law. You can go back to your reserve. It doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the crown. So he said, we got to start changing things. So he, along with some other people, got together and traveled all over the country and started the League of Indians, which is the precursor to the Assembly of First Nations that we have now. Now, I don't want you to think that I'm just going to sort of sit here and wax poetic about my relative. So I'm going to read directly from this volume that talks about him. One example of an attempt to forcibly enfranchise an Indian believed to be too highly educated was the case of Fred Loft. Loft, a Mohawk who was born in 1862 on the Six Nations Reserve, was one of those rare Indians who had completed secondary school. Loft is particularly remarkable in that he personally led the movement to organize what would become the first national Indian organization of any consequence, the League of Indians of Canada. Meetings in 1918 on the Six Nations Reserve and in 1919 at Gordon River drew Indian delegates from Ontario, Manitoba, and Saskatchewan. The movement quickly attracted the attention of Deputy Superintendent General of Indian Affairs, Duncan Campbell Scott. He's a good one. Who saw the League as Bolshevik. a Bolshevik threat and advised Indians not to have anything to do with it. Scott interpreted Loft's statements opposing Indian affairs policies in areas such as land surrenders and treaty fulfillment as a personal insult. He remarked in a letter, "I took a particular interest in this fellow's daughter at Toronto University," and I don't know what that means, "and this is the sort of thanks one gets." Scott resorted to attacking Loft's character and motives. Mr. Loft is a physically good specimen for an Indian, but he is gifted with a smooth tongue, and a couple of years ago, being incited by the example of other Indian agitators, he set out to organize a society for the supposed benefit of the Indians of Canada. By 1921, Scott had determined that Loft's actions were a threat to the department, and after confirming his education and ability to support himself through working, determined that the way to deal with Loft was through forcible enfranchisement. "I fail to see why he should remain a ward of the Crown if it is clearly established that his qualifications for citizenship are such that he no longer requires that protection." Loft was informed of the action to be taken against him. He politely refused. Oh, in Parliament, this place that in every way epitomizes what has been done to us. It was an apology for something so monstrous, so devastating, so incalculable, horrendous. How dare he? How dare he? Not there. Not there. And then, the camera switched outside. And there were literally thousands of people in front of Parliament Hill. And you took shots of many people, obviously survivors, obviously crying, hugging each other. And thought, wow, that was powerful and poignant and remarkable. Remarkable that they could sit there and listen to that and be moved by it and be touched by it. They were the ones who were there, not me. I'm conflicted. I was conflicted then. And perhaps it's not fair to ascribe motives or agendas to the government's handling of apologies. I mean, there have been 3 of them. To the Japanese for the internments, to the Chinese for the head tax, and to Indians for the residential schools. But the overt politicization of suffering and genocide can't be ignored. It's a revisionism that seeks to assuage settler guilt by placing the trauma in the past. We apologize for what happened to you, done to you by other people. It takes no real responsibility for its aftermath. Yes, there was a settlement. Yes, some money got paid out. That's not responsibility. That's not taking care of what this thing created. It devastated our families. It killed our communities. It hurt people. Without acknowledging the colonial violence and cultural oppression committed against Indigenous peoples by the settler state, there can be no peace, no rapprochements, no moving forward. This is an area we haven't really explored in arts. Nobody's really gone there. There's been a couple, with a couple of exceptions. One of them, Jeff Thomas, in an exhibition that he curated called "Where Are the Children?" where he just took photos of residential school children and showed them some didactic work. Most of them, they were the disappeared children, the ones we don't know what happened. Probably died, maybe killed in the residential school, run away either during or after, or just disappeared because when they finally got out, their families were gone or dysfunctional, or they couldn't relate to them, didn't speak the language, they had Christianity forced down their throats. been abused, they could go home. They disappeared. They're gone. So this is an area that's difficult. I know artists will take it on. Some have. There's been a few things. They really haven't done it. But I like to think about something that artist Dana Claxton wrote. She said, through image making, Aboriginal cultural producers hold the great potential to shift consciousness, not only to undo the damage of the structural dehumanization that has been bestowed upon our communities, but to share, honor, and live Indigenous knowledges that span from the infinity of the Milky Way to the Buffalo Grassway water. Robert Lovelace writes, as Aboriginal people, we understand what would change our destiny, but only through a convergence of our own self-determination and a willingness of Canada to decolonize can real change take place. This is not a partisan or ideological issue. Canadians must be prepared to return original jurisdiction to the Indigenous nations whose homelands the state of Canada rests within. Canadians and Indigenous nations need to negotiate real partnerships of mutual respect and benefit, or face a certain future of mutual misery and conflict. Think about places like Attawapiskat, Sheshawan, Ipperwash, where Dudley George died, was murdered in 1995 by an OPP officer. He was unarmed. You could call him a protester. He wasn't a protester. He was standing on his land that had been taken for provincial park. Standing. Got off the bus, stood there, got shot. The only Aboriginal person, thankfully, to die in conflict. Gustafson Lake, Bird Church, Oka, the 1967 white paper. Meech Lake. The list goes on and on. It's about sovereignty, cultural sovereignty, self-determination, and about our rights to exist as Aboriginal people, to live, to have access to everything that this land can provide for all of us. Sovereignty, when viewed through an Indigenous perspective, is predicated on the notions of communal responsibility, cultural autonomy, traditional knowledge, and nationhood. To decolonize is to supplant racist patriarchies in favor of polycultural, intercultural, and anti-racist dialogues, while understanding and acknowledging the place of an inherent Indigenous sovereignty rooted in land, language, culture, and ways of knowing and being. I just want to end with 3 thoughts. Never build your identity on what the oppressor has done to you. Never condemn future generations to ongoing assimilationist agendas. Never allow your image to be used against you. That's what our artists do. It's what makes their art specifically Indigenous. Not the way it looks, not the forms it takes, not the materials that are used. So it's 3 core components. That's what it's about. That's cultural sovereignty. That's cultural autonomy. And that's self-determination. Thank you very much for listening.